When starting a landscaping or a gardening project, having a quality landscape design plan ahead of time can do a lot to reduce future maintenance. In this video, I'm going to share some common mistakes that people make when designing or planning out their landscaping project that can lead to more maintenance down the road. And I hope to go beyond the basics a bit and share some tips that you probably haven't heard anywhere else. Of course, there's no such thing as a no-maintenance landscape. Everything is going to require some level of maintenance, but some things are going to require less maintenance than others, and you can kind of incorporate that into your strategy. And a lot of times when making a landscape design plan, we're choosing ahead of time what kind of maintenance we want to do. I actually had a landscape design client once who hated mowing lawns, but it hadn't actually occurred to her that she could not add a lawn to her landscape design plan. With this in mind, I just want to take a quick moment as we're starting this video out to encourage you to think about what landscape maintenance activities you dislike or what you like, and to kind of keep that in mind as we move through this video. And of course, some maintenance activities are just going to be necessary in any landscape. If you have a garden, you're going to need to spend time mulching and weeding and planting plants, maybe irrigating things when you first start out. This is just a part of it. But it's nice to keep your preferences in mind as we go through the design process. So let's get into some specific tips. And let's start by talking about plants. My first tip for reducing maintenance through landscape design planning is to avoid adding too many herbaceous perennials or annual plants to your landscape design plan. Some quick definitions. An herbaceous perennial plant is a plant that comes back year after year, but in the wintertime it usually goes dormant and it completely dies back so that there's no, living or woody plant structure above the soil surface in the wintertime. An annual plant is one that completes its life cycle in just one year, in just one growing season. So it's usually grown from seed by you or by a nursery, and then they die at the end of the season when it gets a little bit colder. While herbaceous perennials tend to be the most popular in garden design or landscape design, they tend to require a little bit more maintenance than shrubs. For this reason, I generally recommend that people create designs that focus on shrubs and then fill in spaces in between with grasses and perennials. I especially recommend evergreen shrubs that mature to the exact size that you need them to be to act as sort of the backbone for your design. Shrubs will fill in more space over time and will compete better with weeds. And if you choose shrubs that mature to the correct size for your landscape, you won't really need to do much pruning. Of course, the amount of maintenance will depend on the kind of shrub. There are some shrubs that require a little bit more maintenance than others. And also some herbaceous perennials are really low maintenance as well. But in general, you can create a really dynamic and beautiful landscape by focusing primarily on shrubs in the design. There are tons of interesting, colors, bloom colors, leaf colors, foliage textures. You can create a solid design without having to lean entirely on these herbaceous perennial plants. This is just something I don't hear very often in the landscaping industry, is encouraging people to focus their landscape designs on shrubs primarily and then as herbaceous perennials as kind of an add-on. And of course, use native plants as often as you possibly can in your landscape designs, because these plants have been growing in your area for thousands and thousands of years. They're adapted to local climate patterns, soil. So once you get them established, they're going to require a little bit less maintenance than a plant that is from a totally different environment will. The second landscape design mistake that can lead to more maintenance is improperly spacing plants, and this is kind of for two different reasons. My favorite plant spacing method to recommend is where you research the plant's mature sizes and then you space so that they just barely overlap. This means that once your landscape is established, that the plants will be growing kind of shoulder to shoulder or overlapping slightly, and then there won't be any space in between these plants for weeds to get much of a foothold. Another aspect of improperly spacing plants that can lead to more maintenance down the road is actually planting plants too close together. When you first install your garden, plants are going to be pretty tiny. A shrub that gets taller than me is going to come usually in a pot that's only like so big, it'll only be so tall. So when you give this shrub like 5-6 feet in space to grow, it's going to look way too small out in the landscape once it's planted. Resist the urge to fill in this empty space by planting plants too close together, because before you know it, you're going to have to spend time then moving these larger plants away to other parts of your yard. You can always strategically add some annual plants in these large areas in between plants as they're getting established to sort of fill in space for the first year, or even you could do it the first couple of years until plants get established. But of course, remember that annual plants are going to take some work too. You're going to have to plant them every year. They could go to seed and spread around your landscape a little bit. But if you're worried about having this empty space, this is the best way to fill it at first, rather than, you know, crowding plants too close together. This is actually a really common mistake where people will do a landscape design. They'll get a landscape design plan done and they'll install everything, and then they'll just be shocked by the amount of space in between plants in this very first year, and then they'll immediately go and buy more plants and fill in that space. But in just a couple of years, a very short couple of years, that's going to create more maintenance down the road. If you want to learn more about researching plants and choosing the perfect plant, I created a free online mini course. It's called How to Choose the Perfect Plant. It's linked below this video. To sign up, you just create like a little username and password so that you can log in, and it'll keep track of your progress as you move throughout the course. So I hope that it's helpful for you. Landscape design tip number 3, something that can lead to more maintenance, is having too much garden space and not enough useful space. Even planted areas can require a little bit more maintenance than areas that you're using actively. Patios, decks, pools, nature play areas, sandboxes, swing sets, pathways, places that we use for different reasons will kind of break up the landscape design and make it so that we don't have this yard that's a solid garden that we have to weed and mulch. I love to talk about a concept called use-first landscape design, which is simply designing a yard for the purpose of making it as easy to use and spend time in as possible. I'll do another video focusing on this soon, but for the purposes of today, I recommend thinking about what parts of your yard you're not using, and then try to come up with ideas that could make them more accessible or more useful or make you more likely to spend time in them. Essentially ask yourself why you're not using this part of your yard, and then see what you can do to correct that. Common mistake number 4 is leaving your soil exposed or not properly mulching. Mulching is probably the most important and the most under-considered part of any landscaping or gardening project. Anytime you expose the soil, nature has this magical practice of attempting to cover the soil back up again using weeds. This is because inside of the soil there's something called the seed bank, and essentially there's just thousands and thousands of weed seeds that exist in the soil until conditions are right. If you bring them to the surface, they have a couple of days, they're just going to start germinating in numbers. This means that right away we have to cover the soil in plants and mulch. And if you're starting a small garden where it's going to take time for your plants to become established, you're going to have to cover every inch of exposed soil with mulch. The first time you cover a new landscape in mulch, you're going to have to apply the most, and expect to apply at least 2 to 3 inches. Some sources recommend as many as 5 inches of mulch. I've used around 3 inches in a lot of cases and had really good success preventing most of the weeds. You're never going to prevent all of the weeds, but mulching consistently, maybe even every year after that, applying a little, about a thin layer of mulch on top of your first couple of inches, it's just going to help prevent the weeds so much. Mistake number 5 is not having an edging strategy. The area between one kind of soil covering and another defines an edge. Think about the areas where like a gravel pathway and your garden mulch meet, or the areas where your lawn meets just about anything else. As you're making your landscape design plan, be sure to take a moment to stop and consider the edges and where the different materials are going to interact. For example, rocks alongside lawn or grass, it's just going to require a lot of weed eating to keep that looking neat. And in my opinion, that's a little bit more maintenance than just like having to edge your lawn. Also, you don't have to have some sort of physical barrier between every material. You don't have to put in some kind of edging. I think, for example, if you have a beautiful mulched garden and then you have like a little loose gravel pathway, the materials can kind of mix up a little bit. It's definitely not a big deal. I just want you to consider this as you're making your design. We could talk about specifics all day, but for the purpose of this video, I just highly recommend you take a moment to sit down and consider the edges. Mistake number 6 is not incorporating a wild zone. This is one of my favorite tips for reducing maintenance when you have a large yard, because there's always going to be some corner of your yard that you're just never going to go. Maybe it's like a small awkward corner between your shed and a fence, or maybe it's this back section of your property where your neighbors are just going to stare at you if you hang out. The first thing I recommend, of course, is doing the whole think about why you're not using this space and see if you can figure out a solution to that so you can use the space. But if there really isn't going to be any solution, you're definitely not going to be using the space, consider adding a wild zone. A wild zone is a densely planted area. The goal is to establish like a thicket or hedge or just like a patch of nature that's going to outcompete weeds. Ideally, you're going to use fast-growing native plants that are super adapted to, local climate, so you don't have to worry about irrigating them, as well as, native plants are going to support whatever wildlife can make use of that space. You could also incorporate some non-native low maintenance plants in there as well if you would like, but in general you want to focus on the things that you're not going to need to worry about watering, pruning, or taking care of in any way. Once they're established, of course. And if you think about it, the lowest maintenance part of any yard is going to be one that has just established solid plant matter. The more of these wild zones that you have, the less of your yard that you'll actually have to actively maintain. And you can have like a wild space that doesn't have to look like this crazy wild thicket. It just depends on what plants you end up choosing. Tip number 7 is too much lawn. This is because lawn just simply requires a different kind of maintenance than a lot of other parts of your landscape require. You know, you have to head out to mow pretty consistently. You can't let it go for too long, but you really could neglect some other parts of maintaining your yard or garden a little bit longer than that. You also need to have a mower in a lot of cases, maintain a mower, or pay a landscaping service to take care of this. And if you love your lawn, then it is a great thing to have, but a lot of times you can kind of design the lawn away from your landscape. If you want to learn more about this, I have another video that talks about reducing your lawn and reducing your maintenance properly at the same time. Tip number 8 is to avoid using materials like river rock or gravel if you're not prepared to maintain them. Weeds are inevitably going to start sprouting up between these river rocks or in the gravel, and you're going to need a system for maintaining them. Keeping leaves or little bits of organic matter out of these spaces, it's going to be really important because once these things break down, it creates this extra little environment where weeds will be encouraged to germinate. You can pull these weeds out by hand. You can use a tool like a hoe and like loose gravel to kind of get any smaller weeds that are germinating before they get to be too big. You can use like a propane torch weed burner, something like that. There are really no tricks for reducing maintenance in this kind of environment, besides installing it properly so no weeds are gonna come up through the gravel right after you put it in there, as well as keeping it kind of cleaned out. So just keep in mind as you're adding something like a dry creek bed or gravel pathways to your landscape design that you're going to need to maintain the weeds that come up in this space. I hope that these tips will inspire some new ideas you didn't have before and help you design a low maintenance landscape. If you have any additional low maintenance landscaping tips for others, please add them in the comments below this video. If you want to learn more about landscape design from me, of course you can subscribe to this YouTube channel, and I also have an online newsletter. If you go to gardenprojectacademy.com/newsletter, you can sign up for that. It's linked in the description below this video as well. Let me know if you have any additional ideas for videos that you would like to see. Thank you so much for watching.